I'm here in Miami, Bitcoin Miami, with Yat Siu, chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands. And we just recorded an amazing episode.
Web3 to us is about true digital ownership. But the whole point about it is that we have digital property rights. Property rights itself as a foundation in the physical world actually is what gives us our freedom. So ownership isn't only about its value as a utility. It's also value to us as our identity, what it means to us. In Web3, that paradigm has to sit with data. If I actually know what the data is worth, then I'm actually able to not only ask for my fair price, creating a competitive, free and fair market.
You explain ownership in a very cool way because Web3, I mean, the transformative nature of it is that for the first time we have the free transfer of value.
That's
right? And real ownership. And I'd just like you to touch on what you believe that ownership is, because your definition is quite different but cool in a way that I think people can resonate with. Yeah.
And maybe I'll also touch into I think there's a connection between how we view Web3 and what happened in the Web 1 area, because I draw a lot of parallels also to open source, which we're big believers in, and composable as it is right now. But first, Web3 to us is about true digital ownership. But the whole point about it is that we have digital property rights. Property rights itself as a foundation in the physical world actually is what gives us our freedoms, which allows us to do things like the freedom to transact and the freedom to do whatever we want with it. And for third parties to conduct and do business with us simply because we have ownership. By having ownership, the center of attention and the center of power belongs to the people who own stuff, not necessarily the institutions who control that. This is an important point, because this is around basically what the resource of the future, or actually the present, is already. And the resource of the present is data, and the resource of the future is data as well. We used to, in the early days, look at value in terms of like oil, for instance, or things that you would dig from the ground.
Right.
If I own this piece of physical land and it happens to have oil, I've made it, right?
Right.
But you won't allow someone to come in and extract that oil from your land for no value.
Right.
You realize what that is. But if you discover that land 1,000 years ago, it's worthless because we lacked the machinery that was able to extract value from oil and do stuff. You needed technology to come first and take that oil, turn it into energy, and turn it to what it is today. That's data. In the early 90s, we were already creating a lot of data, but we lacked the compute power, we lacked the machinery, we lacked the AI. At that point, it was more brute force AI, eventually machine learning before it became deep learning.
Right.
And the inflection point when actually the AI systems were able to create value out of data was when deep learning really came into being. AlphaGo and the type of systems that basically demonstrated that you can actually create kind of almost intuition out of the data.
Right.
That is basically what companies like Facebook, Palantir, Google, Amazon, all those companies started to take advantage of that. And it all happened behind the scenes. So what was valuable wasn't the data itself. The photos itself is interesting. It's what the data would create. And you look at it today. If we don't have data, then there would be no ChatGPT. There would be no OpenAI as we see it.
The data is everything.
The data is everything.
And people don't think about the data. It's just the ownership. But ownership, what is there behind that ownership, right?
Exactly. And so the sovereignty of that data and the value of the derivatives of the data is something that we need to own. But how do we do that? Well, if you have your data all stored in a private system, no matter what obligations are there, you are at the whim of a central power.
Right.
That's why blockchain is so powerful.
Right.
Because data turns from what was a private good into a public good. And in a public accountable good, I say as well, because the control of that data is based on the consensus of the people who are in it.
Right.
So I look at blockchain not as a technical solution only. That's what the people who don't understand this Web3 ecosystem criticize it for the fact that it's slow or it's inefficient. No, blockchain is a political system. It's just taking basically a this resource, this most valuable of resources, which is data, into a construct that we can finally own and control.
And making it transparent and, accountable. Right. All of the things that are lacking in today's iteration of ownership and
power. That ownership, by the way, is the fuel that had powered physical worlds. Now, I'll get to that. But I think that the most important thing then is that when you have basically ownership of that data, you can then trade it. That's only one network effect. But also, third parties will come to you and say, hey, I want to do business with you because you happen to own that data. In the physical world, this is the example we always give, right, is that because we have actual physical ownership, like the ownership of cars, for instance, which is decentralized, millions of car owners exist in the world, we are now able to conduct business with you, with the owner of the car, don't have to seek permission with the person who created the car. If that wasn't possible, then we wouldn't have Uber, we wouldn't have Lyft, we wouldn't have
Right.
people who create baby seats, we wouldn't have people who create basically all these new sort of electronics and tires and paint jobs.
These ecosystems around the ownership.
And
Yeah.
in fact, the most amazing thing is that the ecosystem of the ownership around cars is bigger than the production of the cars itself. Because there's more people being employed servicing the automotive industry
Right.
in support of owners than actual people manufacturing cars and selling it.
Which is very interesting.
And that is, by the way, true for everything.
Right.
The people who create real estate and sell it to you is, a significant industry, but it employs a certain number of people. But the people who create furniture or services or other things that you use or banking services or mortgages
Or
that
picks and
entire
shovels infrastructure play.
that supports
Yeah.
the ownership of your house
Right.
is far, far greater. If, Apple had full monopoly and control over, who could conduct new services on top of your iPhone, then we wouldn't have cases and we wouldn't have headphones. We
Yeah.
wouldn't have all these type of industries that existed.
Yeah.
So that's really the engine of innovation comes from the fact that we have true ownership and we can build on top of that. And it also creates more network effects and adds more utility to your item. So the car today, in the early example I gave, is much more valuable and we're willing to spend more money on it because it has thousands of network effects. It has thousands of services. The car of 100 years ago, or the Ford Model T, had one purpose: to take you from point A to point B faster than a horse and cheaper.
Right.
And they all were black. That's fine. It was purely utility.
Yeah.
But today, we don't buy a car just to take it from point A to point B. There's a lot of network effects attached to it. Maybe it's social, maybe it's impact,
Right.
maybe it's comfort. But these are things that we decide when we purchase a car. The fact that it drives you from place to place is a given. The example I often put is how it affects our identity. So ownership isn't only about sort of its value as a utility, which is one element. It's also value to us as our identity, what it means to us. When you buy, for instance, fashion, when you choose a place to live in, it could be Beverly Hills, it could be Manhattan, for instance, as an example.
Right.
Why do we choose to live in these places? Because they form a part of our identity or our aspiration. You could buy a house that's much bigger, much cheaper, and perhaps even more comfortable anywhere in the world, but yet you want to live in a crowded small little apartment somewhere because you want to partake in its network effects. And that's basically what ownership means. You buy a Birkin bag, I give this example of a Birkin bag and a Bored Ape. When I gave that example, they were roughly the same price. A Bored Ape is much more valuable now than a Birkin bag. But you don't buy that bag because you want to put stuff in it. You buy that bag because of all the other
Of what it
network
represents.
effects and what it represents, the community and the culture with it as well.
Right.
So for us, and that's why we focus so heavily on NFTs, right, non-fungible tokens, it's because we think of NFTs as these digital stores of culture. We think of that as being the most important thing as us as humans. When we identify it, we identify with culture more than we identify with money. Some identify with money, but I argue for those people, that's because money is their culture.
Right.
Most people have different culture where they see money as the means to the culture they want to achieve, your traditions, where you want to live, impact you want to create.
Very interesting. Yeah. To come at it from that perspective, which is almost like reverse engineering what's going on within this whole ideology and the psychology of, okay, I want to buy this, I want to have this. Behind this ownership, there's a whole other thought process that's going on.
When you go into a store to buy just your clothes, what you're thinking about is not value. Value is an element, but when you're thinking, I like this. Well, I like this is a construct already that completely speaks to your identity.
Right.
And, I like this color, or I like this look, or I like the feeling. These are not actual tangible things, but they're incredibly valuable to us as humans.
Right.
The other thing is that for us, from our perspective, culture is also, the most important thing of any functioning economy. So we look at Web3 and the open metaverse as like a nation state or as an emerging set of nation states. And so for countries and economies to be successful, you need to have strong culture. If you don't, then underlying economies can't be constructed. If you didn't have good culture in the US, you wouldn't have, without Hollywood, for instance, then you wouldn't have Netflix, for instance. You wouldn't have, TVs, right? You wouldn't have all this
The things that makes the U.S. what it is,
Exactly.
essentially, in a cultural way, to the rest of the world and to Americans,
That's
right? So,
and the final point I'll put on sort of why we sort of focus so much on digital property rights is that it relates to freedoms, right? There's a real parallel, there's an equivalent parallel in the physical world, which is all countries that have very strong property rights, that you can own your house and that you can then basically therefore have a mortgage and therefore you can conduct business in a very secure manner because you're certain about that ownership principle, therefore allows for more entrepreneurial and capitalist activities, which translates into much higher GDPs.
right.
Every country that has property rights has a strong GDP, tends to be amongst the wealthiest in the world. Countries that don't have property rights or very low property rights, like North Korea, for instance,
Yeah.
have absolutely have very, very low to almost very minimal GDPs and tend to be the poorest in the world.
It's about that ceiling that we
But they
discussed.
also have correspondingly much lower freedoms. Right? So the more property rights you have, the more power is decentralized,
Right.
the more freedoms you actually have. So there's a correlation. So to us, it's not just that you have value. If you have true digital property rights, if you can have ownership and decentralize that ownership across, Web3, then actually we also ensure that we have digital freedom.
Yeah. And there's something so powerful about when you actually grasp the real concept of true digital ownership, you'll never look at the world the same way.
That's right.
I mean, you just won't. And Michael Saylor said something that I really like because, I consult for a lot of traditional finance clients and they're all about, owning these physical things. And it's hard for them to grasp the concept of why would I want to own something in the digital world? And Michael Saylor says that nothing that you own, do you think you own, nothing that you own, do you not own, except at the power of somebody more greater than yourself, who can come in and take it away by eminent domain or whatever it is. So that really isn't your true property. And so what Bitcoin or, these digital assets represent is portable digital property.
Absolutely.
That's truly yours.
Yes. I mean, there's this famous adage, right, which is, I forgot exactly which sort of historical British person said it, but sort of, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It is not that people sort of want to be corrupted or take control of stuff. It's that when they're in a position of power, it's not just tempting, it's just easier to do so, as we see with monopolies.
Right.
And when Facebook first started out, they didn't sort of aim to do what they ended up doing. They created these open APIs, and people sort of really what the open API structure that they had allowed for people to basically build network effects on top of Facebook. But the network effects actually were consolidating within the data structure that was Facebook, and they were controlling it. And when they realized they had that power structure, they realized that it was easier for them to make more money,
right,
and to serve their particular needs by starting to close it off. And ultimately, with that began this sort of slow form of corruption in terms of, we have centralized power, and therefore eventually we evolve this way. And this is something that has been historically sort of uncannily accurate over time. If you can distribute the power and ensure that power remains distributed, then you can remove that temptation. You can remove that sort of the potential for corruption.
I like the word distribute power and distribute profits even.
Value.
You're right.
Power.
Exactly. And so you said something too about ownership and you actually interacting with these protocols like Facebook and doing it for free, because they're actually taking advantage of all of the things, all the input that you're giving them. And if we stopped interacting for free with Facebook, there wouldn't be a Facebook.
Correct. I think the thing is that we don't know what the value is, so therefore we give it away. And the way we think of it is when we share photos on Instagram, we're actually working for Instagram, right? We're employees, in effect, with no salaries. And the expression we'd say is we're digitally colonized, because our time gets translated into value through data that analyzes us and then sells it back to us in the form of advertising.
Right.
So we are both the contributor and the product, which is, insane if you think about it.
It's insane.
But the reason why this is possible is because we have ignorance. And this is where the parallel between Web 1 and Web 3 is interesting. In Web 1, with the whole sort of information democratization, a trader or a farmer in China would know what the value of his rice was in America. So there used to be this information arbitrage, because I didn't know what it was.
Right.
So I would literally take 99% of the value, and the person in China might still remain poor, but he would make all this profit because he disintermediated based on simply knowledge. When the internet came about, he was able to say, wait a second, the rice is selling for 100 times more.
Information.
Yeah, information.
Yeah.
I want the market price. Now, he might refuse it, but the opportunity is for an intermediary to come in and say, oh, well, okay, if he won't do business with you, I'll do it because I'm happy to do it for 50% revenue share instead of, me taking 99%, for instance. And that creates a free market, and that creates all of these opportunities. That's what happened basically, with Web 1, with Amazon and Taobao, Alibaba, and so on. In Web 3, that paradigm has to sit with data. If I actually know what the data is worth, then I'm actually able to not only sort of ask for my fair price, an intermediary can come in as well and say, I'll offer you a better one if this person will do it, creating a competitive, free and fair market.
Yeah.
And right now we don't know what that is because Facebook won't tell us. So if you're a user in Facebook, you, for instance, using Facebook or Instagram, are worth exactly the same as maybe some person in sub-Saharan Africa, because that's better for them this way. You're averaged down, but probably your contribution to Facebook might be worth thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. Now, if you knew that your network effect in Facebook is worth $10,000, your natural response will be, well, I mean, shouldn't I be getting something free for that? Shouldn't I be getting maybe a cut of that revenue?
Right.
More importantly, though, if they won't do it, an intermediary will come in and say, you're worth $10,000 to Facebook. I'll pay you $5,000 to do it. We already do this in the form of influencer marketing.
Yeah.
If you think about likes, for instance, or if you think about followers, and people game it so they can get it, because that's the only sort of quasi-imperfect measure to say, oh, you're someone worth sponsoring with.
Interesting.
Because you have like 1 million followers, whether it's true or not.
Right.
But I actually don't have the chain analysis to understand, for instance, whether I'm really worth that.
The true network effect.
The true network
yeah.
effect. I don't know that because I only have a centralized platform that tells me to do that.
That you're borrowing land from.
Exactly. You're borrowing land from. So that paradigm, when it becomes open, then allows us actually to conduct business in a much more faster way. And that's the effect that happens when you have digital ownership. You know, when people look at NFTs, they sort of just look at the pictures, but actually it's the network effects that you can analyze. You can say, okay, this is its volume, this is its interaction rate, this is how many users they have. And therefore you can begin, as imperfect as it may be in the beginning, a way in which you can truly measure its network effect and analyze it, and then say that's what it's worth.
And openly.
Openly, which you can't do in the closed networks of social networks, for instance.
Right, which is the behind the scenes, I guess, under the hood, look at what this truly is, or what this movement truly represents, which is so much more than people would understand in the beginning, which happens at the inception of every new technology, right?
But that's also because they've been kept in the dark intentionally. And I think it's not just about understanding the value of data, it's just generally understanding what is value and financial inclusion.
Right.
So the barrier of entry into Web3 isn't a technological barrier. I mean, you know, it's easy to set up a wallet.
Right.
It's easy to participate. Yes, the blockchain isn't super efficient in terms of speed in comparison to, you know, MySQL, for instance.
Yeah.
However, what is lacking is understanding and having financial knowledge. So if you don't have fun,
that's so true. I mean,
the intersection of people in Web3 who are fully Web3 and have financial knowledge is 1-to-1.
Mm-hmm.
They may not have the same financial knowledge, but they have an appetite for risk. They understand, you know, compound interest. They understand yield.
Right.
They have an appreciation for what they're what they're buying.
And the freedoms to be able to access those tools, which we've never had access to before.
Absolutely. But that's only a single-digit percentage. That single-digit percentage used to exist in places like Wall Street. And they had a kind of information, let's call it information arbitrage.
Monopoly.
A monopoly, actually,
Right.
the right word.
Yeah.
The rest of the world didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
And so the sort of implied revolution in blockchain and Web3 is the wider distribution of financial knowledge as a whole. And so if most people in the world, for instance, actually have the same kind of financial knowledge as we have with things like general information, like what we see on Wikipedia, for instance, the world would be very different.
Very different.
We would have, completely different structures and a much more healthier ecosystem as a result.
Right. And the profit distribution that we've not gotten right for the last 30 years. Yes. We have a chance to make it right now and democratize global citizens, right? Uplift global citizens in a way that has never been done before. And what you say about the financial understanding and knowledge is so true. Like the universities don't teach financial knowledge and literacy at a vast range. I mean, we go to these universities in the US that are very expensive and we're competing for these titles and these things in this system that, has been created to make us part of this. I don't want to say worker bee, but, like going through the motions of you go to university, you get picked by somebody because of the university you go to, but meanwhile, we're going to gate the information that could truly make you free. That's kind of the sensation that I have after have been, involved in crypto for so long in Web3. Like we didn't have that access then.
Yes. And the tragedy is that for most, certainly young Americans, their first experience with true financial systems is debt. And that's the problem, right? Because you basically get into some kind of long-term indentured servitude.
Okay, you said it right there.
Before you actually know how to get out of that.
Right.
And this also then creates all this sort of conflict that we see that's happening in places like the US. It's not just sort of you being trained to be this worker bee. It's the fact that you are now stuck in a financial system,
wheel,
which you actually also don't understand.
Right.
If you did understand it, nobody would sign up for 20% credit card interest.
Exactly. And there's so many traps in the US that just look so appealing. And, that's still going on at a very vast rate today. I mean, just all of the things and all the tools that we have access to that just get sent to the mail. Like, hey, sign up for this and you can have a credit limit of whatever it is. And they just get head over heels in debt. And I think it's cool that now we're starting to have this awareness of financial literacy and understanding the basics.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why we're so excited outside of its adoption possibility with Web3 games, because the young generation learns to play anyway. Right? And where do they spend most of the time playing video games?
Right.
3.4 billion people in the world play video games, and almost, I think there's like 95 or 96%, all of our children play video games. So that's
Right.
the medium. But what you're doing in those systems is you're not simulating the real world as much as they try to sell you that you are, because there's no value involved, right? You don't understand what that is. But our children have the capacity to learn financial systems, because if you can teach them algebra, and if you can teach them derivatives, or, and you can teach them math, and that kind of stuff, then you can certainly teach them economics
Yeah.
and compound interest and so on. And so I think that's actually something that I don't know necessarily that teachers can do, because they don't actually know it themselves.
Right.
But that's what game systems can do. Right?
Interesting.
Training, building, interacting,
Right.
basically with real money systems that, may only be $5 or $10 or $3, whatever. It's not really about how much it is, more about the fact that you learn about value.
Right.
And then you evolve over time. And, I think, for instance, by the time you go to college, if you even need to or want to, you'll have a portfolio. It could be very small, but you'll understand exactly how it all works. And probably that portfolio will probably be more deeply in crypto than in stocks, I would imagine. But either way, you basically sort of improve your financial literacy, I think through gaming as a whole.